This is going to be a slightly different episode of the Transcending Influences video series. Normally in this series, I talk about the things that I encountered that influenced me and also how I tried to get out from underneath their influences so that I wasn't just limited by them, but inspired by them. Now, I took them as material instead of as something that just live in the shadow of. And after doing a few of these, I decided that I wanted to talk a little bit more about this process of getting out from under the shadow of the influences of things. Because I think that's incredibly important to be able to do. That if you know something influences you and you're inspired by it and you want to do justice to it, you also have to know how to transcend it. And after talking about it a number of times and thinking about some of the ways that I've used influences and in some cases abused them, I've decided to do a video about how to do this, because in the time that I've been writing, I've accumulated a few bits of wisdom about how this process can work. And they're obviously not going to be universal, but I want to document how they worked for me and see if in turn they will work for you. So the first thing that you really need to be conscious of is what your influences are. And I've discovered that this is actually a lot more complicated and difficult than it might seem, because on the one hand, there's a bunch of things that any of us can point to very quickly and say, yeah, this influenced me, in big part because it's a favorite of ours and it looms large in the mind and it's hard to dismiss. So it's very obviously an influence. It's very easy to credit as being an influence. But then there are other things. And I found that what's happened in my life is that there would be something that influenced me and then it would get buried and I would almost sort of forget about it. But the way that it continued to influence me, even after it had been buried, would linger. And then only much later, after a lot of backtracking, would I realize what this influence had been. One of the things that I'm thinking of, and I really need to see if I can dig this up someday because it's such a blurry memory, but I know that it's there. I just have to do some homework about it. I remember very distinctly this book that was for younger readers that was part of a series that was made specifically for classrooms. It was basically a play for children. It didn't have an ISBN number, a barcode, or anything like that. It was part of this reader series that was only supposed to be used in classrooms, so it's not like I could go to the bookstore and find it, and I can't even remember the title at this distance, and it's so annoying. But I remember this thing very fondly, and I remember being influenced at the time by how I wanted to do something like that. And eventually that impulse faded, but I know that this influence remained, that this feeling of having looked at something that I really admired and, try to do justice to it later. Obviously, the big problem is that because my memory of it is so blurry, I don't know how to do that. But being able to trace that thread back and say, yeah, there was that thing. I'm going to try to put in some more homework later to trace that thread a little more closely and see what turns up. And just being able to say that was enormously liberating because it meant that I had rediscovered something that had been buried, that had been all but forgotten, but still had its presence. So that's the first thing, is that you want to figure out where your influences all came from. And you want to not stop with the obvious stuff. You want to not stop with the things that you remember most immediately, because they're not going to be the whole picture. I'm 100% sure of that. The second thing that you want to do is you want to take a look at the things that you know that influenced you, whether they were good things or bad things, whether you loved them or hated them. And this is also important, that something you despised can also be an influence, because you may be reacting to it. You may be saying, I can do better than that. And you want to look at those things and you want to find their limits and also their boons. You want to look at what's good in them and what's bad in them. And the thing that I've found is that it is just as hard to look at something that you love and see the things in it that are flawed as it is to look at something you hated and see the things in it that are actually worthwhile. They're both really hard. They both require you to be honest with yourself and to be honest about why it is that you like something or dislike something. And it also requires you to accept a certain degree of wisdom about the things that we love, which is that everything is going to be flawed. Many things are only going to be for certain people. Not everything has to have a universal audience. There may be something that appeals to you very directly and very personally, and you have to understand why that may be the case, that why you love it may not map to other people. And so when you draw an influence from it, you may be surprised to discover that other people don't necessarily pick up on that. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do this. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try and honor the things that you really care about, but you should understand their repercussions. when you do that sort of thing. So you want to look at the things that you love and you hate, and you want to find both their merits and their demerits. And you want to do this broadly. You don't want to censor yourself. You don't want to leave things off limits. You don't want to have any sacred cows, and you don't want to have any things that you're just dumping on for the sake of dumping on. I know I've had both. And it's been as hard for me to look at the things that I loved and say, yeah, that's a problem with it, as it has been to look at the things that I hated and said, there's something there to learn from. Now, the third thing you want to do is you want to take what you've gleaned from these things, both the love and the hate, both can be influencing, and you want to roll them forward into your own work. You want to take what's good, you want to examine what's not good, and you want to make your work into something like a response to those things. Because if you see something in a story that you know is limiting, you want to say to yourself, okay, how could I get past that limit? How could I transcend that? How would my story function as an answer, a response to the limitations that this thing has had? And I found that that's a really useful way to make use of the things that you like the best, because that forces you to recognize that they're limited and that you don't have to sit there and slavishly copy everything about them, that you can look at them and say, yeah, I'm going to take a step away from this in my own direction. I know that this story that I liked is very much a product of its own moment in time, and that makes it very narrow. That makes it very limited in certain ways, and I'm going to respond to those things my way. And that also allows you to think about how the audience is going to respond to this, because that will allow you to find an audience that you can address today as opposed to when that thing was created, and speak to them in your own voice. And that brings me to the fourth thing, which is that when you do this, you want to infuse as much of your own life into what you're doing with these things, into the process of transcending these influences, as much of that as you can. You want to infuse the work with whatever it is that you have to bring to the table, even if you don't think it's very big. Because I found that one of the things that really tends to block people up, especially when they're writing fantastic fiction, is they say to themselves, I haven't been anywhere, I haven't done anything, my life feels so small, how am I supposed to write about fantastic stuff, when I haven't actually lived? When everything that I've had has come out of movies and TV and books and the rest of it. And I said, even a trip to the grocery store, if your eyes are open, can be an amazing experience, but your eyes have to be open. And if your eyes are really open to whatever it is that's around you, you're going to have that much more that you can take and put into whatever you're going to be doing to respond to these works that you love so much. I've talked before about my day job, which is that I write for a company that does publications aimed at IT professionals. And so I do a lot of writing about technology. And I don't put a whole lot of stuff about technology into my work per se. I don't do techno thrillers. I don't do much cyberpunk, at least not in the traditional sense, because a lot of what I'm getting from my work experience and from my life experience in my work is a very different slice of stuff. It's more about the expectations that people have about these things and the disappointments and the sociology. It's a different flavor, I guess you could say. And I've talked about this in a previous video. I'll link about that down in the description. But so whatever it is that's in your life, you've got to be able to open your eyes all the way and see it, and then take those things and use them as part of your way of responding to the things that you liked so much, or the things that you found most repellent. So one of the ways that I've done this most recently, I mentioned before that one of the books I'm working on is called Pavilion 7. And it is, in my way, a response to a lot of the cyberpunk that I consumed as a younger person, Blade Runner in particular. I've jokingly referred in the past to Pavilion 7 as Blade Runner on the beach, because it takes place in an island resort. And a lot of the stuff that goes on there has some of the Blade Runner flavor, but there's a lot of other stuff in there that I tried to include and layer on top of it. And so the more I did that, the more I found ways to edge out the original influence, to sort of push it off the table bit by bit until all that was left was my stuff, or something that at least had my flavor to it. And this wasn't something that happened all at once. This was something that happened over the course of a few different drafts of the book, and over the course of thinking about, ahead of time about what it is I wanted to do with it and why, and, what it was about the original material that I wanted to pay homage to, and what it is about the original that I wanted to step away from. And so one of the things that I knew that I wanted to step away from was that I didn't just want to clone the atmosphere and the flavor of the original stories. I didn't want to necessarily create another noir. And I said, well, there are things that are noir adjacent that might be informative here. And one of those was the political thriller, the spy thriller, the Jean le Carré flavor, as it were. And so I wound up delving into a bunch of that stuff and saying, yeah, there's stuff here that I can use, and that actually has more to say in the way that I want to about what I'm trying to talk about. That there was a much more explicitly political orientation to the story that I wanted to put in there. So there was John le Carré, and there was Graham Greene, and there was a few other authors of that vein. And they all proved to be a way to enrich this, while at the same time not also turning into copies of those things. Because I was always conscious of how I was trying to bring my own perspective and sensibilities and worldview into all of that. So from the top, again, you want to be conscious of your influences. And these can be good influences, these can be bad ones. These can be things you've liked or disliked. It's a lot harder than you think, because you sometimes look at something that you like and say, it's untouchable, but that's a bad habit. You must break that habit. So you want to look at those things, you want to find their limits, their flaws in the good things, and you want to look at the bad things and say, there are things here that I can learn from. You take those and you roll those forward into your own work, both the good and the bad, and then wherever you can, you infuse your own life as you have lived it, not as you have garnered it through other work, into that. Now, that last caveat, your life as you've lived it, I don't think I made this clear, but there are bits of that infused into this new book. The description that I gave probably didn't convey that clearly enough, but it is in there. It's just not something that I can unpack very succinctly in the course of a 10-minute video, but it's there. So this is something that I really want more people to try and apply where they can, to look at what it is they love, and yet at the same time understand that for all of their love of it, it's just another thing. And that the real expression of love for those things is going to be in coming into your own as completely as you can, as a tribute to those things, instead of simply, duplicating what they've done or extending them into a redundant direction. So I hope all of this was of some use, and until next time, stay curious.